Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we get started with the interview, if you haven't heard, I've started a Patreon account for the podcast. Patreon is a way for you to help support the show and get special rewards in return, such as a thank you shout out on the show and an enamel button with the Queer Spirit logo. This year, I've also added access to videos of the podcast interviews and a free monthly live virtual sound bath. If you'd like to join in supporting the show, just go to patreon.com/queerspirit. You can also find the link in the show notes. Any Patreon funds remaining after the basic production costs will be donated to nonprofits supporting diverse queer communities. Once again, that link is patreon.com/queerspirit. Thanks for your consideration. My guest today is Matthew Clark Davison. Matthew is the author of Doubting Thomas, released in June of this year. He is also the creator of The Lab Writing Classes, and his textbook, The Lab, Experiments in Writing Across Genre, co-authored by bestselling writer Alice LaPlante, will be published in 2022. His prose has been recently anthologized in Empty The Pews. Matthew also teaches full-time in San Francisco State's Creative Writing MFA and BA programs. Today, Matthew shares about how he first started writing in services while he attended the notorious Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco after he ran away from home. Then, after writing his own monologues for acting auditions, he realized he was on to something. We also discuss his new book, Doubting Thomas. He shares how the political landscape of the last two U.S. presidencies influenced the story. We also explore the themes of control and surrender within the story's protagonist. Find him at MatthewClarkDavison.com. Hi, Matthew. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you for having me, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I thought I would start out by having you share with us a little bit about how you first got interested in writing poetry and prose and fiction.
Sure. So my route to where I am now is an unusual one. I suspect that this is probably unusual for the average person, but perhaps not so much for the queer person. I ran away from home when I was 15. I landed in San Francisco when I was 19. My best friend got sick with AIDS and with the complications due to his immune deficiency, and then was going to a church in the Tenderloin in San Francisco called Glide. My roommate was also singing in that choir at the time, my roommate, Dana. And so I don't think that I could have gone to a church at that point in my life had I not had one best friend saying, I'm singing a solo today, and another best friend saying, you got to come with me. But I did. And then I ended up getting really involved there. And Jan Mirakatani, poet, incredible writer, and so eventual friend of mine, noticed that I was always writing in a notebook and had asked me whether or not I wanted to join a writing group that she and June Jordan were putting together as a sort of a branch of Poetry for the People that June Jordan had been doing at UC Berkeley. And at that time, simultaneously, I thought that I wanted to be an actor, and I was going to auditions at places like Theater Rhinoceros and other queer places. But because of my age, I wasn't often able to find roles that were monologues that had the kind of content that I was interested in expressing at the time. And so I wrote my own monologues, and I kept not getting casted, but asking by the casting director who wrote that. So I sort of took that as a hint. And June and Jan saw something in me that I hadn't been able to see in myself. And also I had dropped out of high school and had gotten a GED and taken a few units at various community colleges along the way. And so after that experience, Jan encouraged me to pursue a degree. So that's how I got started in creative writing.
And what kinds of things were you writing in those notebooks in church?
I think that, I was volunteering there. After Richard died, a lot of space opened up in my life. And so I was volunteering there on the phones. And so there was usually on busy days, for example, I did work the day that Randy Schilt's memorial was at Glide. And so the phone was ringing off the hook that day. And then there were other days, it was just like a Tuesday at a church. And, there would be a few phone calls here and there. And so really it was like me managing my boredom in between those phone calls. And there was just so much going on at the time with, Reagan in office, with AIDS happening. There was just so much going on immediately in front of my face. And I say to people like you, in our first pandemic, and when we were in the highest risk category, just like everything was notebook worthy. So I have no memory and not nearly enough courage to look back at those notebooks. So I don't remember exactly what I was writing in them, but I do have a sense that there was plenty to write.
Yeah. Do you still have them?
I do have some of them. And I also have all these letters that I wrote to my mom after I left home. And I just have yet to muster the courage to actually look at them.
Now, I think it's worth bearing a little time and explanation for any listeners who may not know about Glide. But can you share a little bit about what Glide is? Because it's pretty notorious here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, there's an incredible history and timeline that I think exists on the Glide website. And so I wouldn't want to get that wrong, but that's a great resource for the true, unbelievable history of Glide. Lizzie Glide was a Methodist whose family belonged to a Methodist church in that area of San Francisco before I think it became associated with, before it accumulated the associations that people that live in San Francisco might have with the Tenderloin. And it wasn't doing really well, as far as I can remember. This story bears scrutiny. But according to my memory, Cecil Williams, the Reverend, who was also a civil rights activist and a Methodist preacher, was asked to come to Glide, and he was an absolute innovator. One of his first actions was to take down the cross, and his reasonings were really like, we were going to celebrate life versus focus on death and sacrifice. And he ministered in ways that were really unusual to the populations that were in that neighborhood, some of whom were sex workers, some were trans folks, some were both, some were just the neighborhood school kids that were coming and going from school sometimes, and everything in between. And so he wanted Glide to be a place where anybody could come. And so he sort of got rid of any oppressive dogma. And literally, like the first time I was there, I was so defensive because I was raised Catholic and because I had by the time I was 12 years old, I had heard enough from so-called leaders in the Catholic Church about people like me. And I just really had like a absolute bias against any kind of organized religion. But like he was literally screaming, Cecil Williams, the word like gay people, like he was naming all of the people that were actually there as being a vital part of the community. And he said to me, Matthew Clark Davison, as an individual once, I would learn later that he was quoting Angela Davis, but he said to me, I said to him, why are you so kind to gay people in the way that you are? Like, what led you to that? And he said, because if they're going to get me in the morning, they're going to get you at night. So yeah, Glide has continued to thrive through all of that. And so soon after I met soon after I met Janice Mirikitani, the writer, who I call Cecil Williams. I call Cecil Williams Jan's husband. And I was blown away by Jan's writing. And then, of course, I became a volunteer there and met all sorts of incredible people. At Glide, you could go to a service there and literally sit next to Sharon Stone or Maya Angelou or Bono or even Prince one time on one side of you, on your left, and then on the right side of you, you'd have somebody, from the community who lived on the same block. And it was a very exciting and interesting place to be.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I just thought it would be really great for people to hear a firsthand experience about what it's like to be there and that kind of thing. So thank you. So you have a new book that just came out this summer called Doubting Thomas, and that's the main reason you're here today. And I wonder if you could share with our listeners a little bit about that book and what inspired you to write that story.
Sure. Yeah. So Doubting Thomas centers around this guy named Thomas McGurran, who's a fourth grade teacher at a really fancy private school. It takes place in the waning part of the first Obama administration, 2013, in very progressive Portland, Oregon, is where it starts. And a couple of things were going on in my life at that particular time. I think that because I lived through some of the experiences that I mentioned earlier, whenever the pendulum would swing to a place where gay marriage was becoming legal, and the ways in which a lot of liberals were interpreting progress as a result, Barack Obama being nominated president based on the fact that he was, the way that they were talking about progress based on the fact that he was Black and president scared me. Mm-hmm. Because a portion of that narrative really was that we're kind of post-racism and post-homophobia because of this progress. And people that are racist and or homophobic are sort of like out there, and we are over here. And that just made me nervous. Mm-hmm. So one aspect of the novel was dealing with that anxiety, but I also had a real life couple of experiences that fed into the narratives in the book. So one of those things was I'd finished reading the wonderful author Justin Torres's novel, We the Animals, that focused on three brothers, one queer. Mm-hmm. And that was a dynamic that by the time I reached the end of that novel, in a way that was absolutely no failure of the novel sets up it achieves what it sets out to. And it's one of my favorite ones. I've read it, taught it, bought it for people. But I continued to wonder about those brothers and their adult lives. Mm. And so I took that thematic concern, and I had never written about my own brothers and what it was like for me to be a brother. And I left home when my younger brother was 10, and I left, and my older brother had already been kind of gone before me. So our lives had reconnected as adults, but we missed this huge part of each other's lives. And so I was interested in exploring that dynamic. And then simultaneously, I was witness to an exchange between a very sweet and kind person who was also very progressive in the world, who had gone to a fourth grade teacher's class and came back and reported to an administrator in front of me that the teacher had touched a student inappropriately. And he kept, the administrator was really good at her job. And so she forced him to talk about facts. And basically what he ended up saying in this moment was, he kept repeating, well, he was really flamboyant. He was really out there. He was really gay. And it turned out that he had only touched the boy's shoulders. Mm. And I just remember my blood ran cold for, I think, 3 reasons. One, for that administrator's job. For that teacher's job. I got really, really scared for him. And then I got really scared for the kid. And then I got really scared for all of the people who are actually touched inappropriately and not believed, mm-hmm. because of this weird association that people have with gay men and pedophilia. So I thought, I was struggling to find an entryway in to kind of get my character Thomas back into the middle of his family. And my own brother had a cancer diagnosis at the time. And so I wanted to avoid that because I had made that up for the character prior to my brother getting the diagnosis. And it was just kind of too much for me to deal with. And so I concentrated on this more scandalous thing. Mm-hmm. Eventually the two came together.
And then we have the book where you have to get it to find out what happens.
Yes. Yes. How a scandal like that can turn into man sort of being thrust back into the center of his family after having avoided it for many reasons for many years.
Yeah. So I've read a little bit of the book so far. And, one of the first things that stands out to me just in the first chapter is this way that you describe Thomas having this certain kind of self-assurance in the way that he just confidently knows certain things. He knows about, the weather, and he knows the right time to do this and the way to do that and that kind of thing. But then there's also this, hanging over us in the story is this self-doubt or unsureness about what's going to happen to him and his job, even though he is found innocent, and what's going to happen to his brother and his family with his health. And I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are about maybe your own experience or what you were trying to interweave in there. I mean, I know for me, as someone who follows Buddhism, I think about the idea of impermanence, this idea that things are always changing and we can never be sure of anything, or people who are always wanting to control. You know, there's a theme of wanting to control and that we can't control. And on the one hand, we have, you know, you talking about what was happening during the Obama administration and that, you know, things swinging heavily to the left, but then the right having this extreme reaction to it, or being able to control what happens just with life and death and health. So I'm just curious to know, like, where you are among all of that.
Sure. It was fascinating for me to work on this book for the years that I did, because Thomas was successful at doing all sorts of things that I wasn't. The first and foremost being he was successful in passing, I guess you could say, as straight and sort of flying under the radar. And I think that because, you know, some people in my life, especially in younger times, when my appearance sort of would suggest that I was much more rebellious to societal standards or conforming, thought that I was really brave. And I wasn't brave. I was a failure. I was a failure in the sense that I failed to conform. I tried and failed to do what I needed to do in order to be safe and to keep my body, mind, and spirit out of harm's way. And once I realized that I had used every single one of my tricks in order to do that, and that they all failed, I just decided, okay, I'm going to take my queerness to the max, so that whenever people had negative reactions, it would go to maybe my clothing or my makeup or my hair or something versus my soul. And I had to, you know, work really, really hard in order to deprogram all of the crappy stuff that I learned in the society that I feel is so misogynistic and as feminine, or what people perceive as feminine as a kid. And probably these days, absolutely, I would be called gender nonconforming up until I was 10 years old. And so the reactions to that were so harsh. And I just thought I was playing. I was just being myself. So Thomas actually succeeded in a way that I couldn't. And so first of all, I was just fascinated by inhabiting a character who could succeed at being both a good boy, in a sense, and also who had convinced himself that if he was hypervigilant enough about what people react to and what people don't react to, that he could stay under the radar and kind of have a assimilated version of what was his brother's lives. And because he had his older brother on such a pedestal, I think, from the time that they were kids. And so even though this is very, very unlike my own, that segment of the novel that you're referring to, where he does this really long list of like, I trust my judgment. You know, it's just like the writer always has to know a little bit more about the character than the character knows about himself. And so I, Matthew, the writer, know, oh, these are Thomas's ways of trying to deal with the reality that, like you said, we cannot control anything. But he has somehow convinced himself that if he can hone his own judgment and stay objective enough and keep his emotional reactions to things at as much of it, like he's even while he's literally listening to, you know, these investigators talk about like the pornography that they found in his computer, he's thinking about like what he's making for dinner. Because he has so trained himself to detach from whatever kind of emotional reactions that he might have. And so I'm the opposite. I absolutely, if you take the percentages of like Thomas's personality and make them, like if you were to say, oh, he's 75% logical and 25% emotional, I'm exactly the opposite. So part of why I write fiction is so I can inhabit or imagine inhabiting experiences that are really different from mine. But I do think that Thomas, like many of us, try to come up with ways to prevent himself from getting hurt, and that those are some of his.
Well, I think you're making a really good point, because I can confirm that that's actually true for a lot of people, especially queer people. You know, as a therapist myself, I see a lot of queer folks doing that, trying to find ways of coping through dissociation or through control or perfectionism and that kind of thing. And yeah, it's hard to and scary to let go of those things and think, oh, I can't control that, because we're just trying to create safety for ourselves.
I see Thomas, and I also even see the woman who makes the accusation, because the child in the story, the 9-year-old fourth grader, Toby, only says, Thomas touched my pants. And it's true. Thomas does touch his pants. He sort of froze. He's a kid that has like a mechanism inside of his brain. And it's happened a couple of times to this kid in the classroom where all of a sudden, like the attention turns to him and he sort of freezes and his pants accidentally fell down. And so Thomas saw that Toby froze and went and pulled him up. And there was no sexual contact whatsoever. But the parent, for a variety of reasons, feels like she's losing control. And I really do believe that she's convinced that something untoward happened because of the mechanisms that she has in her life in order to maintain her status and control.
Yeah. I'm drawn by this idea that about when you set the book and, thinking about what was happening in the United States politically and socially, and wondering when you started writing the book and if it was before or after, being in the Trump era when things sort of swung in the opposite direction and the reaction in the country with what was happening sociopolitically then too.
I'm the least psychic person that I know. And I'm also often make guesses about the future and find that I'm absolutely wrong. And I just think that, like many people that survived the era that I did, I have certain anxieties that I have to just deal with and acknowledge about like the bad stuff that's coming down the pike. And so take what I'm about to say in that context, because I am so frequently wrong. But there's a line in the book where Trump had just announced like a maybe plan to run for president. And there's like, I didn't even name him in the book. And I didn't in the early draft prior to him getting elected, where he's mentioned. And I actually believed that he absolutely could get elected because I felt like too much of the people who perceived themselves as being super liberals and were too convinced that the fight was over based on these more superficial optics. And, there were tons of people all along who in the Trump era finally were listened to, who for decades were saying, wait a minute, this is progress, but there's still all of this other work that we need to do, this deeper work that we need to do about our country's history and about the deep ways in which these sort of societal ills are entrenched in our systems. So I did start writing it during the Obama era. I think that the very first bits of this book that I worked on must have been Justin's novel had come out, I think. So it was maybe 2011 or I'm horrible with chronologies, but it was a long process, this book. And the first draft of it was completed before the Trump administration.
So sort of halfway through, you were influenced by both administrations in a way then, and what was happening in the world.
I desperately wanted to believe that the progress that we had made meant more than it did.
Yeah. Well, we all did.
Yes. Who wouldn't want to believe that?
Yeah.
And so I think that I was also examining the ways in which I might have become lazy because, there was a time in my life where I was in such a high risk category. And so once I'm okay, what is my responsibility to others? And because I was raised Catholic and because there's like the biblical implication of doubting Thomas in there, that one of the biggest questions is like, are we as human beings beyond a certain point able to be our siblings' keepers? And then if so, what does that mean? Like, can human beings actually succeed at challenging themselves in order to lend their own resources to others when it's really, really, really tricky? And of course, there are examples of people that show us that that can be done, but they seem to be the exception rather than the rule. And so I think I was just exploring that big sort of philosophical question myself.
So it sounds like part of what you're saying the theme is here, because before we started recording, you said a big part of the story is about the relationship of the three brothers. But what I'm also hearing you say that more thematically, it can be about like, how do we take care of ourselves in a time of need while also taking care of others in a time of need? And how do we balance that care and what is needed?
Yeah. And I do, I was raised to believe that, and there's parts of my religion that I'm really grateful to have been raised with. And also, my mother is one of my biggest mentors and heroes in so many different ways because of the multiple ways in which she tried to enact her dogma around her own religion. And that's developed over time. She's different now than when I was growing up. But I saw her constantly volunteering. I saw her bringing in folks who needed tutoring or shelter into her home. I saw her spending a portion of, her salary as a nurse to help folks that didn't have as much as we had. And so I grew up sort of noticing that my mom, who had a lot of struggles, was decidedly happier after she would do these things. And so it was evidenced enough to me that part of our contentness in this life is our willingness in order to help others. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't need to be convenient and it doesn't need to be easy. And I think that I stuck by some of my friends who had some pretty extreme struggles at a time that I was really, really young. And I didn't know that I thought in my own mind that that would mean that they would survive. And so when they didn't, that became a dilemma that I think a lot of people face in one way or another, which is, what's my reward for being a good boy or a good person? Mm-hmm. And when there isn't one, when there isn't an obvious one, then how do you sustain that sort of looking out for your siblings?
Yeah.
I still kind of don't tell anybody because I don't like people to know this about me. It's just a little bit too vulnerable for my comfort. But I do deep down believe that we're all each other's siblings and we're all each other's keepers, including people that I would be tempted to hate and who I vehemently disagree with.
Mm-hmm. Well, you just said that publicly on a podcast.
Whoops.
The secret is out. Well, as we begin to wind down, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
Reading and writing. I grew up not being a reader. I grew up not being interested in books. And I think that I can, and I've always had the capacity in order to, maybe it's because I'm a gay Gemini, I don't know, but I've always had the capacity in order to see myself in people who on the surface weren't like me. Like, give me the opportunity to see myself and I will see myself. But even still, I didn't need characters that looked and sounded and had share the same demographics as me, but it took me a long time to find the first book that really illuminated something about life or something about experience as a human being that I related to, whether or not it was my experience. And once I did, I found a really easy recipe, which was to find out what those people read. And then I would read that. So that practice of writing, trying to distill down my first reactions and to question them and to get to what might be underneath it, absolutely makes me queerer and queerer every day. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I love doing, and my husband and I do this together, is we walk around the apartment constantly in what we call invisi-heels. And it's basically you're on your tiptoes, but anything, vacuuming, doing the dishes, marinating a bunch of vegetables to throw on the grill, done in invisi-heels can increase one's joy almost instantly.
Great. I'm curious what that book was that you found that you finally resonated with.
I remember it being different for different books, but I'm, again, just terrible at chronology. And so I have very distinct memories, the world opening up for me with Dorothy Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina in a particular way, with Maya Angelou's I Know How the Cagebird Sings, which I became familiar with Maya Angelou because she was a regular attendee at Glide. I remember that feeling. There's a writer named Jim Grimsley who wrote a couple of novels. Two that, again, I found out about Jim Grimsley because of Dorothy Allison. So those were some. Eventually, Michael Cunningham. James Baldwin is a person that I read and reread. So it took me a long time to find those writers. But once I did, I was just like, oh, there's this too.
So, Matthew, where can people find you and grab a copy of your book?
I am on social media, Matthew Clark Davison. My first name, Matthew, has 2 T's, and my last name, Davison, has 1 D, which is the very first letter. So it's Davison. And my middle name, Clark, is like Clark Kent. So Matthew Clark Davison is my website.com and also all of my social media.
Great. And they can find the book through your site?
You can find that book. And also I teach in the community. I'm a full-time lecturer at San Francisco State, but I also teach a in-person and also fully online version, both versions of a writing class. And I've done so since 2007 in San Francisco, called The Lab, which is also going to be a textbook co-written with Alice LaPlante for W.W. Norton in 2022. So those things and everything else that you might want to know about Matthew are available on the website.
All right. Well, I'll have the links in the show notes so people can find them there as well.
Nick, thank you so much for giving so many wonderful people. And I hope to be included in that somebody else's opinion. But I'm calling the other people wonderful on this show, a platform to kind of, illuminate the beauty of the experience of being a queer person. I appreciate you.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for being here and sharing your piece of the pie.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.